to macro level theories. Remember, macro focuses on less of the individual experience and more of institutional causes for prejudice. Um, Macro level approaches are focusing on those collectives of people. Definitely review institutions in the first module content if you're really fuzzy on what that means to talk about larger institutions and sociological forces. So the concepts in macro theories approach things like institutions and different variables, social, political, economic, basically the roles played by various ethnic groups and the social organization within those groups. The macro-sociological approach assumes that both the attitudes of individuals and the relationships among different social groups are, for the most part, shaped by these larger social forces, political, educational. The patterns are really caused by the nature of our society as a whole and the positions of groups within it. Those societal and group characteristics are really major factors in determining the individual attitudes. So it's really the larger forces onto an individual versus maybe individual intrinsic reasons for things happening. Those attitudes perpetuate those inequalities and then cause the attitudes. Let's kind of delve into that further. A macro level theory would really think about societal forces such as the political system. What is a political system in this country, in any country that a sociologist might be studying? Is it a democracy? Is it a dictatorship? Is it something kind of in the middle? And what are those power relationships between groups? Are minority groups equally represented in the governmental system? Are individuals of a minority group less likely to vote? Why is that? Another thing that a macro sociologist would consider is the economic system. Is it capitalist? Is it socialist? What's the system there? And how is, more importantly, income and wealth distributed? Is there a lot of wealth in the hands of a little, and then a lot of poverty, or is it a relatively equal society in that regards? Then there's the consideration of culture, right, and ethnic groups. What is the predominant culture of the society? How do values get shared in that society? Historical conditions are also pretty important. If there are different racial or ethnic groups, did they come into contact as a result of voluntary immigration? Or did one conquer the other? Perhaps in the instance of the United States, a group was brought here against their own will via the slave trade. So how did history shape some of the broader societal considerations in any society? But specifically, we study the US in this course. The first macro level theory that we're going to talk about is functionalism. And if you have taken intro or social problems, I hope you've been exposed to functionalism. One of the big proponents of socialism, well, I guess one of the breadths of socialism is that everything in society exists to serve a function, functionalism. Everything that happens in society meets some sort of need or enables the society to operate. So when things aren't going well, it's because something changed that limited the function of things. This perspective involves a number of assumptions. First, that society is made up of interdependent parts. The functioning society depends on all of these things operating in optimal conditions. Because of different parts of society depend on one another, a change at one point could have an impact elsewhere, right? So if something changes in society and that function changes, then it has reverberation, it has the butterfly effect. Another assumption is that every element of society performs some function. Somehow it meets a need. It's also kind of an unstated implicit notion, but society tends to work for the general good, right? So the implication here is that society is trying to function for everyone. Societies really are trying to get some sort of stability. Each part is performing a function interrelated with other parts. So a drastic change would really kind of knock that off. And that society is trying to have some sort of consensus. So at least on basic values. And really consensus is necessary for cooperation, which becomes kind of dependent on each other for our needs. If we all decided that we weren't going to cooperate, then the society would no longer function in a way that is beneficial. Think of the functionalist theory when we start to dissect major institutional racism, or things like the glass ceiling when we talk about gender. There is society is functioning in a way that might not benefit a whole group. One other competing approach to functionalism is the conflict perspective. These two perspectives do tend to be competing. The basic underlying premise of this approach is that society is made up of groups with conflicting self-interests, right? Conflict theory. Often one group is dominant, and in that case, society takes on a form that serves interests of that dominant group. One could argue in the society it is race, but socioeconomic status. Really, the wealthy white Americans tend to be the dominant group in the conflict theory perspective. The contradiction between those two, right? Those who have access to good life and those who don't have access to good life. When we talk about the conflict perspective, it's the haves versus the have-nots. This perspective involves the following assumptions. Conflict is built into society. That is, that societies naturally lend towards conflict because wealth and power and resources are all limited things, and they're distributed unequally, right? Humans are by nature very selfish animals, right? We want all of it. Give me as much as I can get. Oh, you got a vaccine? I want to be the first, right? So we are trying to get those resources for our own self-interests. Another assumption is that competing interest groups have unequal power. Usually power is not equally distributed, and these competing groups with unequal power use their power to keep the social structure in a way that serves its own interest, its own group. When consensus does appear in society, it's artificial and unlikely to last. This is kind of a little bit of pessimism, right? Usual cause of consensus are either somehow coerced or propaganda, right? That consensus typically doesn't exist. There's usually a disproportionate control, and it's unlikely that a level of consensus stays in a society for super long. And they also operate on the fact that conflict in society is desirable, which is really kind of tough to grasp, but the conflict theory thinks that conflict is a necessary part of social change. So without conflict, there's no one's going to give over that power voluntarily. That equality isn't going to come from someone's goodwill, that it's going to come from conflict. Both macro theories, can be seen as a part of a larger area, right? The study of social problems, not individualistic problems, but the larger social problems. So a definition of social problems is right here for you. When everyone agrees that a condition exists that threatens the quality of lives and values, here's the definition. I don't need to read it for you. But when we talk about social problems, we are talking about two different things, right? Both the functionalist and the conflict kind of disagree about two particular areas. One is the definition of social problems, which is a matter of really kind of values. When we think about social problems, we have to say what's considered to be a problem. And a lot of times this has a real value judgment to it. If something is a problem, it has some sort of consequences that people think is undesirable. So what's undesirable is up for debate. Excuse me. Cause. So if we can agree that something is a social problem, what is the cause of that problem? Because this is sort of a factual question, it is in some sense really up to research to decide what that cause is. However, values really do kind of have some influence. Think about the nature of family. The conservative side of things says that the less people getting married and less classic, what's considered to be the norm, right? Mom, dad, biological children, has been decreasing in this country. And conservatives feel as though that is really part of the cause of many social problems. Whereas the other side of things, the liberal side of things, feel as though the concerns in society have a much larger blame than just the makeup of a nuclear family. I guess I'm going to leave you with the fact that neither the functionalist or the conflict theory is entirely explaining of everything, right? Neither is really all right. Some problems may be caused in part by the behavior of a subordinate group, whereas another might be by the dominant group and the structure of our institutions. So the job of a researcher is really to answer the question, how much of each, right? How much of it is society and how much of it is individual, or how much of it is the structure of our institutions and how much of it is the majority and minority dominant group. So it's a spirited debate that we're going to continue having, but now you have 4 sociological theories between the last video and this video to pull from for your assignment about sociological theories. Thanks for listening.